This class will deal with organizational growth and in particular vertical and horizontal integration. So to start, let's look at growth strategies and see how growth may come about. What are the factors that lead to corporate growth? Well, first of all, growth involves the attainment of specific growth objectives by increasing the level of a firm's operations. So growth we normally associate with an expanding business, a growing business. It could be that because of the onset of technology, the physical space of the organization doesn't expand, or indeed the workforce may not expand. It may be that the capability of the technology is such as to enable the business to produce more, and in a sense the business grows. It grows in profitability, it grows in capability, but not physically or not in terms of manpower. That's a possibility, but generally speaking we're talking here about meeting specific growth objectives. The management set out growth objectives and they wish to attain those growth objectives by altering some aspect of the business. Now, typical growth objectives for businesses, well, increase in sales revenue. That's a good sign of growth. I mean, when the business is selling more, when the business has a better market share, perhaps overall sales are up, that's a good indicator of growth. An increase in earnings or profits. Well, an increase in profits may not actually be associated with increased sales. It may be associated with a decrease in costs. Don't forget that profits are made up from revenue and costs, sales revenue and costs. So specifically, profits are the difference between the two. So an increase in profits doesn't have to be associated with an increase in sales. It could be associated with a decrease in costs. It could be other performance measures. For example, productivity, more output per worker. It could be introducing the product into a different location or into a different country. It could be expanding or having plans to expand in terms of its marketing initiatives, or it could be expanding in terms of its use of technology and moving towards a more technological and a more advanced workforce in an effort to compete internationally and get more sales and hence, of course, more profits if possible as well. So these are typical ways in which companies may consider growing, or the reasons why they may consider growing. The growth objectives for not-for-profit businesses, well, increasing the clients that are served or the patrons that are attracted. Many businesses are not-for-profit. They're businesses based within the communities, or it could be national businesses, charities, or that sort of business who they're not there to make a profit, they're there to provide a service. So growth in their cases could be simply having more clients, more people using the service, and that would be growth for them. It could be broadening the geographic area is also an objective for not-for-profit businesses. So let's say an organization who was helping schools or helping hospitals or helping communities. Broadening their geographic area may be seen as a growth in those businesses. Or they may widen the programs they're offered. Let's say they're offering some advice on health. They may extend that to cover support for people who have just had medical operations or who are in need of an operation or whatever. So they're widening their counselling and they're widening their involvement. So they're increasing their programs. They're increasing what they do. So we have two types of organization. We have profit organizations and not-for-profit organizations. And with the profit organizations, the typical reasons for growth would be typical measures for growth, I should say, is increasing sales or increasing profits, or it could be simply greater involvement in the market, and that could be seen as growth. In this session, however, we're going to deal with vertical and horizontal integration in the rest of the class, just to deal with growth through these type of measures. So we'll start with vertical integration. Now, this is an organization attempt to gain control of its inputs. This will be backward integration to suppliers. So in this case, vertical means moving towards the market or back through production. So it's vertical integration. The business is trying to expand its operations to open a company that produces, let's say, the inputs to its business. So now it's the company that is supplying the inputs is itself. So it's not buying from other suppliers, it's producing the inputs, it's manufacturing what it needs and feeding it into the business. So in a sense, it's backward integration. It's going backwards, but it's expanded. It has expanded because now it's got another business. This time the other business is supplying the components, the raw materials or whatever it is that the business itself is using. That's backward integration. So it becomes its own supplier. It could be forward integration. It could be that the business also opens outlets and sells its products, perhaps directly to the customers. Could sell it to the public, perhaps. So the business becomes a distributor. That's forward integration, forward vertical integration. Backward vertical integration, it becomes the supplier. It opens a business to supply the components that it needs. That's backward vertical integration. Forward vertical integration is it moves closer to the customer, closer to the market. It opens distribution outlets, it opens shops, it opens ways in which the customer can buy directly from itself. It cuts out shops and warehouses and so on. So vertical integration, well, considered as a growth strategy because the firm's operations are expanded beyond the primary business. So it is a growth strategy. The business now, if it's backwards vertical, it now has a business further back producing the raw materials that it needs or the components that it needs. If it's forwards vertical, it becomes the distributor. It moves closer to the customer. So it is a growth strategy because it now has a bigger business. It's got two businesses, if you like. It's one producing the components or perhaps one selling directly to the public or whatever. So it has grown. It's bigger than what it was before. Consider the role of outsourcing in achieving the same objective as vertical integration. Well, that's really what the point about outsourcing is, that it's a way of buying off competitors cheaply, but it could be that the business invests in companies that supply the components. Many companies in the West, for example, will open manufacturing plants in low-cost countries where labor is much cheaper and costs are much cheaper. They have grown as a consequence, but they're also producing products perhaps for other companies and other types of products as well, depending on the technology they're using. So we have to be careful when we talk about vertical integration and particularly vertical backwards integration, that we don't confuse it too much with outsourcing. There can be links, but I think we need to make the case very carefully. Well, the benefits of vertical integration strategies. First of all, it um, reduces purchasing and selling costs. There's less cost. Discounts don't have to be given, for example, if it's vertical forwards. Discounts to wholesalers and retailers and so on. It's selling more directly to the customer. So in selling, there are benefits. In purchasing, there are also benefits, because if it's vertical backwards, it's now producing the components and the parts that it needs. It's producing those itself, and therefore, of course, any profits that it would have paid to another company to produce it, those profits, what would have been part of that company's profits, will now accrue to this particular business. So it does reduce costs, the costs of purchasing and the costs of selling, as well as, of course, it may simplify paperwork and administration. There is also improved coordination of functions and capabilities. It's much easier for the company to secure its supplies if it is manufacturing and producing the supplies that it needs. It has it under its own control. Likewise, its supplies to the market can be more finely coordinated. It knows what the outlets require because it owns the outlets if it has vertically forward integrated. So it knows what the outlets want and it can produce to meet those requirements. It can protect its proprietary technology quite easily. If it has innovated certain machines or certain technologies to do certain processes, you can protect those because it is now a bigger part of the market. It controls its supplies and it controls perhaps its outlets. There is more protection for the technology that makes the product. It is more insulated, if you like. The costs of vertical integration strategies, well, reduce flexibility as the firm is locked into products and technologies. Once it integrates vertically, if it backward integrates, it has a company producing the components that it needs. But that also reduces its flexibility. If the product it's producing starts to dip in the market, perhaps the product life cycle, it goes into decline, customers start to turn against it, tastes turn against the product. It's not got one business now at risk, it's got two. It's got the business that makes the product and also the business that supplies the components to that business. So it's more vulnerable as a consequence. So that needs to be taken into account. There is an exit barrier. It's difficult to get out of the market. Once it's vertically integrated, either forwards or backwards, there is a commitment. And it may be difficult to sell off assets or liquidate the assets of the business because the assets are so particular to that line of production. The machinery, the technology may all be built around the production of a particular product. If the product goes into decline, a la the product life cycle analysis, if the product does go into decline, then those assets, those machines, that technology, they may not be worth a lot to others. They may have to be fundamentally changed and restructured to be useful to others. So there is an exit barrier. It's difficult for companies to get out of that line of production, particularly if they have vertically integrated. They're more committed. And sometimes there are difficulties in integrating various operations. It's not as easy as perhaps I've been suggesting. If a company has a lot of components and the components are made from different, uses a lot of components made from different materials and using different technologies, it might be better to buy these in from various suppliers rather than set up a company trying to make all of them itself. So it's sometimes vertical integration is not really that viable. It's not a good idea because the components that are required by the business are so diverse, they're so complicated, they come from a whole range of suppliers. So setting up one company to try and produce those may not be possible. It's also, of course, the case that when a company does decide to vertically integrate, either forwards towards the customer or backwards towards the source of the raw materials and the supplies, no matter which way it moves, there are financial costs. It has to open a business. It has to get a management in place. It has to get workers, and workers have to be trained, and it has to get premises perhaps, and it has to set up the production process. It's all costs. And that has to be met out of the balance sheet of the existing company. So it's not a cheap option. And if it tries to acquire a business that happens to be one of its existing suppliers, let's say it's talking about vertically integrating backwards, and it wants to buy one of its existing suppliers, that could be expensive. And if it's starting up, well, as I said, it's got many costs. Costs of recruiting the right people, setting up the management, setting up all the organization. It's not that cheap. So that is a problem. Now, horizontal integration strategies. Well, expanding the firm's operation through combining with competitors operating in the same industry and doing the same things. This is horizontal. It looks at who its competitors are and tries to do deals with them, to share transportation, to share warehousing, to share bulk buying, so it can get discounts off the suppliers. So it shares the buying with some of its competitors. It may not sound very logical, but it is, because it's reducing costs, and it's in both their interest. So horizontal integration is a possible strategy for growth. The company will grow because it is apparently more efficient. In fact, what it's doing is it's collaborating with competitors. Or it could be opening a business producing a similar product itself. It's somewhat the same as diversifying its production line. This is an appropriate corporate strategy as long as it enables the company to meet its growth objectives. So it's a good idea to collaborate with others, if possible, providing, of course, it meets its growth objectives. And it also needs to be strategically managed to attain a sustainable competitive advantage. Having set up an agreement with competitors, it needs to be monitored carefully, and there needs to be confidence on both sides that it's working to their mutual interest, that they are competitors perhaps, and now they're collaborating. That could be a problem. All sorts of problems. For example, let's say they decided to collaborate and share marketing areas. So one company will operate in one district in one area, and the other company will work in a different area. Now that is a straightforward agreement, but that has to be managed, because it may be the case that there is encroachment, that one of the companies is selling in the other person's territory. It's not according to the agreement, but it could happen. So it has to be managed, and it has to be monitored, and there has to be sustainable competitive advantage. There has to be something for both of them in terms of their position in the market, their security, and their corporate objectives, that they are being met and the companies feel more secure and more profitable as a consequence of this type of deal. Of course, it must be legal and it must meet regulatory guidelines. Sorry. It needs to be legal because the government wants to see competition. Customers want to see competition because that's how prices are kept low. That's how companies attract customers, by offering a good service at the right price. Well, if companies start to agree to collaborate, then they may also start to agree to set the price. And price fixing is not something that the government would want to condone. It's not in the interest of the customers. And it's particularly important if the product that's been produced is an important product, perhaps something related to health, or some essential item for the home, or some essential item of food supply or transport or whatever. So price fixing may not be possible because of government regulation and government monitoring. So what we've got in this session is we've got two types of integration, vertical and horizontal. The vertical is subdivided between forwards towards the market, that's vertically forwards, where the company now opens outlets itself, or moves forward towards the customer in some way, opens an organization that's closer to the customer. Or it could be vertical backwards, where it starts to produce its own components and process raw materials and set up a production line further back, so that it's knocking out one of its suppliers, or perhaps knocking out all its suppliers. That's what we mean by vertical integration, forwards and backwards. And then we've got horizontal integration, where the business collaborates with other companies at the same level. These companies are producing products which are perhaps in competition, or it could be that they're not producing products in competition, they are simply using the same technologies, and they are agreeing to produce each other's products because they have more suitable technologies. So the products may not be in direct competition, but they're using similar technologies in production so they can collaborate. So companies are coming together horizontally. They're at the same level, if you like, the same distance from the customer. And if the integration policies are successful, then we could expect to see the companies grow as a consequence, grow in terms of amounts sold or in terms of profitability, or both. But that's all I'm going to deal with in this session, so we're going to leave this topic of vertical and horizontal integration. To leave it at that and say thank you for watching.